Come, let us sing to the Lord. Come, let us bow down before Him. His banner is love over us, and His mercies are new every morning. And I'll sing, oh.
Oh, guys. Welcome back. We're wrapping up 1 Corinthians tonight. We said that the message of the letter is basic Christian living. And we went through an overview of some of the major points of the letter. First 4 chapters dealing with them not picking their favorites. We went to chapters 5 and 6 where he warns against blatant sin and gives them instruction on how to handle it. And then we have this large section from chapters 7 through 14 where Paul is answering their questions. And then he has a final address in chapter 15 on the end times, and we'll be talking about that tonight. So tonight we'll have chapters 12 through 16. Chapters 12 through 14 go together as one unit, with chapters 12 and 14 being a discussion of spiritual gifts and the proper usage of the spiritual gifts in the church service, what we call the church service, with chapter 13 in between those being kind of sandwiched or bookended. Chapter 13, of course, the love chapter, which we oftentimes just kind of pull out to give a sermon on love or something, and there's no problem with that, but we need to understand that chapter 13 is in the context of the spiritual gifts at work in the church. And so those spiritual gifts are supposed to be used in the context of loving one another. And so we'll see that as we go. I'm going to start with chapters 12 and 14, going through some of the protocol things with the gifts, and then we'll come back to the love chapter 13 on the back end. Now, we've done many teachings on this already. There is a teaching that I did on spiritual gifts that's on the APC channel, where you go to have your introductory videos for new members. There's a teaching also on prophetic protocol that Jeff did on the same in our new members videos. Jeff has also done other extensive teachings on these topics, and so I won't go into great detail here. What I want to do here is to try to show these things in the context of the entire passage of chapters 12 through 14, so you can kind of get the sense of that flow. Chapter 12, specifically verses 8 to 10, is where we get our list of demonstration gifts, or sometimes called manifestation gifts. And again, I refer to this in the Gifts of the Spirit teaching that I do on the New Members channel. But let's see what these are. First of all, I'm going to give you my paraphrase version of this list of gifts: the word of wisdom, the word of knowledge, exceptional faith, special healing gifts, dynamic miracle working power, prophecy, recognition of various spirits and spirit influences, various languages, and the interpretation of languages. And one of the things I bring out on the teaching on the spiritual gifts is that we have several of these kinds of lists, and I explain there why there sometimes might seem to be a discrepancy between these lists. Not any particular single list is a full list of all the gifts. But here in this list, we do get the list of demonstration gifts. In other words, the kinds of gifts that show a kind of special ability that you would not be able to have without the Holy Spirit empowering you to do that thing. Again, I won't go into all of these gifts. We've done that elsewhere. What I want to do is show the context of how Paul is bringing these out. And the context is in the back half of chapter 12. Where he talks about one body with many members. The whole point that he's making here is, yes, we have all these different gifts, but they're supposed to work together like parts of a body work together for that body to function. And so, in other words, we need to use the gifts in such a way that they're beneficial to the entire body. We don't use them in a way to prop up ourselves, but we use our gifts for the benefit of others. And every gift is important, and every person in the church is important, and every person carries a gift, and all of those things are important. And there's not one that's more important than the other. We need all of these things working together for the church to function in the way that God designed it to. Now, moving over to chapter 14, skipping over, Paul begins to talk about specifically the gifts of prophecy and tongues. And he says that the gift of prophecy is maybe not more important or better, but there's more of a benefit to the church from the gift of prophecy than the gift of tongues by itself. Now, if you have a tongue with an interpretation, then that basically functions the same way as a prophecy. But what he's saying is, we're going to use English, okay, because that's the language we're using in our church. If I say words in English, or if somebody uses words in English to teach or to admonish or whatever, you're going to understand what that is, what they're saying, and that will be of benefit to you. But if someone is speaking in a language you don't understand, that can't be of any benefit to you. And so that's why Paul says that the gift of prophecy is, we'll say better in terms of being able to communicate an idea that tongues would not be able to communicate without the interpretation. And the key verse there, verse 5, I wish you all spoke with tongues. Notice he's not saying that he doesn't want them to speak in tongues. But what they're doing in the Corinthian church is speaking in tongues, and then there's no interpretation, and so it's just a bunch of gibberish, and nobody is being benefited. Nobody is being edified or built up. And he's saying, no, if you have that tongue, interpret that thing so that people can be built up. Otherwise, we want prophecy to build up. Again, verse 5, I wish you all spoke with tongues, but even more that you prophesied, for he who prophesies is greater than he who speaks with tongues, unless he indeed interprets, that the church may receive edification. And again, we'll see this coming back over and over, that the point of this thing is for edification of the body. And what that means is building up. Edification literally means building up like a skyscraper from a foundation and then building on that. So whenever you see that word edify, think in terms of a building being constructed with solid construction. This is the purpose of it. Okay, moving on in chapter 14, more on the purpose of the gifts. We've seen this already in chapter 12. It's for the good of the church. And so in verse 3, prophecy is for edification, exhortation, and comfort. Verse 26, the diversity of the gifts is for edification. And again, in other words, building up, as we said. And then finally, the gifts should be exercised in an orderly fashion. So part of what we should be doing here with these gifts is to be in order. And many people have commented on what that looks like. The bottom line is we have a prophetic protocol here at APC, and really a gifts protocol. And much of that is laid out on video and in the archives of messages. So familiarize yourself, if you're not already, with our protocol, because we do want to be in order with what we're doing here. And you can read in the Bible what it says about how that order is established, whether it's in the paraphrase or in another translation. As part of this section on order, we have this paragraph kind of stuck in the middle of this that says that the women should be silent. And so I want to speak just a minute on this. We've taught on this before, but seeing this paragraph in the context of the whole piece here on order in the church is important. Notice that Paul cannot be saying that women should be silent all the time in church. They should never speak or never do anything. He can't be saying that because he just said in chapter 11 that the women should pray and prophesy with their heads covered. Well, you can't pray and prophesy without speaking. So he can't be saying, don't speak, women. Okay. I want you to also remember, or know for the first time if you didn't know before, that the Bible is a very progressive kind of a book. The Christian religion or in the early church, as well as even in Judaism, we look at some of these Old Testament things and think of how harsh they were and so forth. Well, you have to think of the context of what else was going on around there. Judaism and Christianity have both been, from the beginning, very progressive, what we might call women's rights. Maybe not women's rights like we see in 2020, but the cutting edge on elevating women to a place of respect and honor versus other cultures that were around them. That's something to remember as we look at this passage on women and whether they should be silent. Well, as I said, the paragraph is right in the middle of this section on order in the church and the use of gifts in being in an orderly fashion. And so what's happening is the women are in Corinth are being disruptive. It's not a question of not speaking. It's a question of not speaking at an inappropriate time or in an inappropriate way so as to be disruptive. They're disrupting the flow of church by asking questions. And Paul is not saying don't speak at all. He's saying if you have a question, don't disrupt the service with it. Take that home and ask your husband later. And so it's clearly a question of order in the church and how do we establish that order. So here's how I said it in the paraphrase. And I really do believe that this gets across the essence of what Paul is trying to communicate in this passage. He says, this is again my paraphrase, your women have a desire to learn. That's wonderful. Just make sure that they are not asking their questions out loud right in the middle of church. That would be disruptive and out of order. Instead, let them ask their husbands later on when such a conversation is more appropriate. This would be the proper way to demonstrate a submissive spirit. So, women, yes, you are allowed to speak in church. Paul says so in chapter 11. And so let's leave that there. Now, I said I was going to skip chapter 13, so we're coming back to that now. In the middle of this discussion on spiritual gifts, chapter 12, chapter 14, we have the chapter on love. And his purpose here, Paul's purpose in including this is, if you're using the spiritual gifts and you're not using them from a posture and from a heart and from a desire to love the people, then you have totally missed the point, and your gift actually may become destructive if it's not used in a loving way. And so he says, I could be the most gifted person in the world. I could have all the gifts. I could operate in all the gifts more so than anybody else. And if I don't have love, not only am I nothing, but my gift profits me nothing. And then he goes into the characteristics of love in verses 4 through 7. And then he talks about the eternity of love. And he said, prophecy will not last forever. The gifts will not last forever. Because once we're standing face to face with the Lord, we won't need prophecy and those other gifts. But love will remain. And so love is eternal. Faith, hope, and love will abide forever. And the greatest of these is love. We've got to pursue love in addition to the spiritual gifts. It's not one or the other. It's both, according to 1 Corinthians 14:1. Okay. Moving on to chapter 15, where we really switch gears and Paul begins to talk about the resurrection. And the main idea here on this resurrection section is the Corinthians are thinking in terms of there not being an end times resurrection of people, of Christians. So what happens when I die? Okay, I die, and then at the end of time, do I just stay dead, or do I come back to life? And Paul is trying to rectify that, to correct that false teaching. And he says, no, there will be a resurrection in the end. When Jesus returns, the church will be resurrected. And the kind of proof, or the first fruits, or the deposit, or the sign that is the case, is that Jesus rose from the dead. So because he rose from the dead, we expect to rise from the dead. Okay. This is the main idea of the chapter. And so Paul begins the chapter by a short defense, what we call an apology, not apologizing for something like I did something wrong, but an apology, the Greek word, meaning a defense of. We call it apologetics. If you're familiar with Ravi Zacharias, great man who just passed away a couple weeks ago, one of the great apologists of our time. Okay, Paul is giving an apologetic here. He's giving this defense of the resurrection of Jesus, very short one, but what he uses there is eyewitnesses. And he says, look, he was seen by James, he was seen by Peter, he was seen by the 12, he was seen by 500 people at one time. And 500 people at one time cannot see something that's not actually there. In other words, you go to one person and they say they saw something, you can say, well, you dreamed that. Okay, but 500 people at the same time, they didn't dream that. They actually saw that. And so Paul appeals to the eyewitnesses. And he says most of these people are still alive today, so you can actually go check it out for yourself. You can ask them if what I'm telling you is true. Jesus died, he was buried, but he rose again on the third day. And this is the basis for our religion. If there is no resurrection, there is no Christianity, period, end of story. And so we stake everything on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is the basis for our religion. Because God came to earth as a man, lived a sinless life, died, was buried, and because he rose again, we can say our God is not dead, he is alive, and we have a basis for putting our faith and our hope in him. And that's really the point of this chapter. At the end of the chapter, verse 35, he anticipates a question of how will we be raised from the dead? And he says that's a foolish question. we're going to have glorified bodies. It's not like our bodies that died are going to come back out and be the same and be put back together. We will have glorified bodies. What exactly that looks like, we don't know, but it's going to be magnificent. It's going to be glorious. And then at the end of the chapter, he says, we'll all be changed. And I have some points here about what that looks like, from corruption to incorruption. In other words, from a body that can decay to a body that will never decay. It'll be in the moment, in a twinkling of an eye. It'll be when the trumpet sounds, and the dead will rise, and in the end, we will be victorious. And so that's the message of the resurrection of the dead. We will be, and we'll talk about this more when we get to Thessalonians, but we will be raised. Those who die will be raised to new life. Those who are still alive will stay alive, but we will be transformed into glorified bodies, and we will be with Jesus from that point on forever. And so that's the message of 1 Corinthians, and specifically this week, chapters 12 through 16. Next week, we'll deal with 2 Corinthians 1 through 7, and we'll see you then.
Jesus, you alone are our cornerstone. Hide within